Hello, my name is Lai Thin, and thank you very much for joining me on this short presentation on a topic that is close to my heart, which is about enhancing the success of transitioning into a preschool setting for children with special educational needs. And I'll be addressing this topic from three perspectives, but mainly I'll talk about that a little bit later. So, as an inclusive education advocate, my colleagues and I, in the early intervention field, we always get this question either from parents, from preschool teachers, kindergarten teachers, or even therapists and early interventions specialists about how can I prepare the child with special educational needs to adjust better into a preschool or kindergarten setting. And by preschool and kindergarten in here, we are referring to mainstream preschools and mainstream kindergartens. So, as I mentioned earlier, I'll be looking at this topic from three perspectives. Number one, definitely from the perspective of the preschool and kindergarten. And secondly, from the child and the family in terms of what kind of preparation they need to do during the transition process. And also, lastly, what kind of support that the support professionals, meaning the early intervention practitioners, therapists, and also special educators can do to support the child and family, as well as the preschool and kindergarten to prepare for the arrival and the participation of the children with special educational needs in a mainstream preschool setting. Before I move on to strategies that may support a child with special needs to adjust better in a preschool setting, I'd like to talk a little bit about why they find it difficult or challenging in the first place. And a lot of times this comes down to difference in environment between an early intervention setting with the preschool setting. And one of the most obvious difference is, of course, the physical environment. And over here, we're not just talking about how both buildings will look different, where the buildings are located. It is more about the sensorial experience and the spatial experience when the child is in the preschool environment. So take an easy example, which is the noise level. In a preschool setting with with a higher number of children in the preschool setting, definitely the noise level will be slightly higher than what a child with special needs would experience in an early intervention setting, which is much quieter and less distracting than when they are in a preschool. Next is the social environment. So, like I said, in the preschool, there are more children, so naturally, the amount of communication, play that is happening in the preschool is um, relatively or significantly higher than what a child with special needs would experience in an early intervention setting. The amount of turn taking will be quite a lot compared to when they are in an early intervention program. And this also trickles down to the kind of expectations that is put onto a child with special needs in the preschool setting. So usually the kind of expectations that we are referring to here is quite hidden. It's not very obvious, especially to a child with special needs. The expectation to play, the expectation to communicate with words, the expectation to conform to the kind of culture or norms that is established in the preschool, and a lot of times the behavior expectations that the preschool already has for children. So these kinds of hidden social norms or social rules or expectations to interact are usually not picked up by children with special needs, especially children who have difficulties with social skills, difficulties with executive functioning, like attention and memory and planning, as well as children who has difficulty in play skills. Lastly, instruction. For children with special needs who have been through early intervention programs and therapy programs, very likely they are familiar and quite used to small group instructions or personalized one-to-one instructions. And in these settings, verbal instructions are usually paired with visual supports. So let's say an early intervention specialist would say, please line up. They would also show a card with pictures of children lining up as as a cue or support for the verbal information that is conveyed. Whereas in preschool setting, these kinds of arrangement in terms of how instructions are provided to children may not be the same as what is practiced in the early intervention settings. And for children with special needs to adjust to the kind of instruction that is directed to the whole group instead of a more personalized or individualized with more individualized attention, it might be difficult or challenging for the child to register the message that is being conveyed at that time by a preschool teacher. Besides that, children with special needs, when they are in an early intervention setting, the tasks that are assigned to them may be broken down into smaller tasks in much more frequency than might happen in a preschool, where preschool educators might not have the time or luxury to do these kind of differentiation in tasks for all of the children under their care. So, as a preschool educator or preschool leader, what can you do to support a child with special needs to adjust better into your preschool? Before I move on, I'd like to just let you know that I approach this from a student-centered and strength-based perspective. And this student-centered and strength-based perspective will actually not just set the tone, but set the direction for how we implement and practice inclusion as well. And for that, and for me, the most important thing is to always ask what the child needs to be successful. And actually, success means very different for different children. And for children with special needs, they also need support in different aspects in terms of learning, in terms of social interaction, in terms of participation, and maybe also in terms of independent skills. So these things need to be taken into account when we plan for the arrival and the participation of the child with special needs in the preschool classroom. And success here also doesn't mean in terms of how the child with special needs measures against other children, but rather what the child can do and can be stretched to do in that particular time, duration, or period of learning and development. And when you have established what kind of support you need to provide to the child with special needs to be successful, then next step is for you to find out what you can do to help the child participate meaningfully in class. And actually, I already mentioned that earlier, which is to put in place the kinds of supports that the child will need to be able to participate meaningfully. And next, naturally, you will naturally, an educator will be prompted to start to adapt, to either adapt the environment or the instruction, the way you teach. Because support for children with special needs is not just in terms of the learning support or the social support or the play skill support. A lot of these learning, social, and play support is also tied closely with the physical environment that the child is in, and as well as the social environment. Some of these adaptations may be big, but a lot of the adaptations are also quite small that you can already start doing to help the child to adapt better to the preschool environment. And I'll go into a bit more detail later in the presentation about the kinds of adaptations that you can do in the preschool setting. And lastly is to teach and model, and this is one part that I find quite important to continue to nurture and foster an inclusive environment, not just for the child with special needs, but also for other children without special needs. Inclusion is not just about the child with special needs fitting into the current environment that they're in. It's more about how the environment adapts to support the needs of the child with special needs. Even though it's important to teach learning skills and also social skills and play skills to the child with special needs to be able to have a more meaningful interaction in the preschool environment, it's at the same time, it is also very, very, very important. I can't emphasize this enough. It's also very important to teach and model to other children without special needs to know and to learn how to support the child, how to interact with the child, how to play along together with the child in the way that the child feels successful. To help you to provide better support to children with special needs during the transition process, I have listed down some questions that you may ask parents of children with special needs or early intervention practitioners and therapists that the child has been seeing, just to help you get to know the child a little bit better. You can also revisit these questions from time to time because children's development change, and these questions may be helpful for you to get to know the child better. So the first question is, how does the child interact with his or her peers, familiar adults or unfamiliar adults? And the kind of interaction pattern between the peers, familiar adults, and unfamiliar adults sometimes may be different in a child with special needs, and it might be important to find out so that you may support the child better when he or she is in a situation where she needs to be interacting with an unfamiliar adult, like a new teacher. And in terms of supporting her interaction, does she need any kind of communication support, like a communication book or a communication device? And the second question, and that brings us to the second question, which is, how does the child express her needs, wants, and thoughts? Finding that out will be helpful to you as well, because especially for a non-speaking or non-verbal child, the child might rely on certain gestures to express his needs, wants, and thoughts, or he or she might rely on certain sounds, certain vocalizations to express a different wants or needs. And the third question is, does the child have sensory needs? And if there is, how can we support that? And this is especially important in a child with sensory processing disorder or children with developmental disabilities or children with rare diseases. So finding out what kind of sensory needs the child have is very important to enable greater access to participation for the child. So for example, if the child is sensitive to loud noises, then so some children might be able to tolerate loud music, but they might have a higher sensitivity for very loud and sudden noises, like the sudden like turning on the vacuum cleaner without a warning. So finding out the types of the kind of sensory needs that the child has will be very helpful in helping the child feel comfortable in the preschool setting. And when the child feels much more comfortable and safe in the preschool environment, the level of engagement and participation will naturally increase. Another important question to ask is, what kind of adaptations will help the child to access learning and demonstrate what he or she learned? As you know, for children with special needs, the usual pen and paper type of learning materials don't usually work or are not motivating. So it is very important to find out what kind of other support tools and strategies will help the child to access learning, and not just accessing learning, but how to show you what he or she learned. And the next equally important, and sometimes I think much more important question, is about engagement. What does being engaged mean for the child? And how does that look like for the child? What does engagement look like in the child? And lastly, the question is, what does success look like for the child? Which goes back to my point in the beginning. Right, next, I'll talk about the role of the child and family in the transition process. Actually, for the child and family, what is most important in the transition process and adjusting to the preschool is to feel comfortable and secure and welcomed in the preschool. And one of the first things that the child and family can do is to become familiar with the new setting. And to become familiar, they need to take steps to understand the culture and the expectations of the preschool. And usually these kinds of culture and expectations of the preschool are usually not obvious, implicit. So this would require the child and family to visit the preschool in advance. And not just that, they also need to ask the preschool teachers, other parents, other children, what their experiences are like in the preschool, so that they could take steps and plan to prepare the child mentally and physically to start learning and participating to basically start a new routine in a new setting. And this brings me to the third point, which and in terms during the preparation process, this may or may not involve skill development for the child. And usually these sorts of skill development don't just happen 1 week or 1 month before the child is supposed to enter the preschool. These kinds of skill development may also need to start much earlier, and these skills that may need to start much earlier will involve some of the skills I've mentioned early in the presentation, like social skills, play skills, communication skills, and also some learning skills like paying attention to teachers, taking instructions, and carrying out instructions, those kind of implicit skills. Sometimes we call them hidden curriculum. And all these, like I said, will involve a lot of communication, especially from the caregivers or the parents' side. The parents, we encourage the parents to communicate with preschool educators and give information to educators about some helpful strategies and what kind of supports that they can do, they can implement in the preschool setting. And reasonable and it's very important as well for it's especially important for parents and preschool educators to sit down together when they talk about helpful strategies and supports, to decide what sorts of reasonable accommodation that both sides can agree upon. Some of these reasonable accommodations may be visual supports to be put in place, especially for schedules, and also where things are, like where can the child get the toys, where can the child put their bags in, those kind of things for visual supports. And also maybe flexible seating for the child, maybe flexible grouping, or even a tool or a fidget tool for the child to hold while the child is in class. And next is the role of support professionals. And support professionals here, I mean early intervention practitioners, speech and language therapists, occupational therapists, physiotherapists, etc. kind of therapists. If you are a preschool teacher, do not hesitate to ask for help from support professionals, because I believe we both have the same goal, same purpose, which is to help the child with special needs to be included in the mainstream setting. So we support professionals are usually always ready to share insights and some helpful strategies from our experiences that will help the child to be successful in the preschool setting. And if you are a support professional, don't be shy to offer opportunities for training and support to preschool educators, because I believe preschool educators would like to learn from you as well. And support professionals can also help the child, family, or preschool educators to develop a transition plan, just to help them have a clearer idea and a clearer direction on how they can work on building in the kind of supports that the child will need in the preschool setting, which is relatively new to the child. And one thing I would like to emphasize that support professionals do while you are carrying out the early intervention program and therapy programs, which is to always when you are writing an individualized education plan goal, IEP goal, to aim for the inclusion of children with special needs in the long term, which will help the child and family to transition much better or have a much smoother transition into a more inclusive setting. And now I'll go into some helpful strategies that I find supportive for a child to transition more successfully into a mainstream setting. It's also a toolbox that I use to help educators to implement inclusion in their setting. So the first one is to clarify expectations. Always give clear instructions to children with special needs. Explain what you mean. Sometimes what you think is clear to you and maybe to some other children as well, may not be clear to the child with special needs. So it's always good to clarify expectations according to the child's vocabulary, or and that also ties into the second strategy, which is visual support. It's always very helpful to pair your instructions and verbal instructions, especially with visual supports. It can be pictures, especially for children. Pictures will work, but again, check also that the child with special needs understand what the picture is trying to convey. So visual supports actually help to facilitate understanding and definitely help to facilitate communication, especially in children with communication difficulties. So some of the visual supports that you can use in the preschool setting is, that every child in the class can use is asking for help, I need a break, or visual cards to help children to identify or communicate feelings. And for some children who are using communication boards or AAC, which stands for Augmentative Alternative Communication, these needs to be put in place for them to help them communicate. And one more thing that will be helpful for everyone is a visual schedule. And the next one is also tied together with clarifying expectations and visual supports, is social stories. Social stories is very helpful, not just for children with autism, but children in general, and not to mention children with learning disabilities. Because social stories actually, the way social stories is written is to help children to understand context and changes, and it's especially useful for when changes happen. For example, like for transition, you support professionals, parents, and preschool educators can can make a social story on starting new school for the child with special needs. And you can also have another social story about meeting new friends, and when they have already started preschool, if there is a change in schedule or teacher, you can also use social stories for that. And the next adaptation that you can put in place in your preschool classroom or preschool is to set up a break box or sensory box, or the whole corner, depending on the space that is available to you. This sensory corner or sensory box, we have found it helpful for children, especially with self-regulation or emotional regulation. And we make this available not just for children with special needs, but for all children in the classroom, because having breaks or tools to help them to self-regulate is actually good for their emotional development and social development. It is actually important to allow children to have different tools to choose from, because children have different preferences and different needs when it comes to self-regulation. And especially for children with sensory needs, having a sensory box or sensory corner is very helpful for them to regulate themselves if there is an under or overstimulation of senses. And it will be very helpful for children when you also include some guiding instructions for how the children can use the break box or sensory box, and also include a timer there if the child is allowed to have a break, because that will also help the child to know what their boundaries are when it comes to a break, or a sensory break, or just a brain break. And the next adaptation strategy is to always include a choice for children. The ability to choose actually is very helpful for children to participate and learn, and this will also help the child with special needs to develop a sense of autonomy and belonging as well when they choose how they want to participate in the classroom. If you can, you please also include choices for children with special needs in terms of what sort of materials or learning activity that they want to do to learn. But I also understand that it's not always possible in a preschool setting. So in that case, it would be good to include a choice for the child with special needs, whether he or she can do group or individual work, or they can group or individual play, in terms of where they want to sit, in terms of how they want to complete the activity, the sequence of the tasks, sequence of different tasks, if there are 3 to 4 different tasks to complete in the activity. And also, if you are able, provide different choices of materials for the child with special needs to use. And if, for example, the child can use a color pencil, or a thick color pencil, or crayons or paints to complete an artwork. The next strategy is altering the task or process, or otherwise known as differentiated instruction. So some points for you here, just to give you a quick overview, is to modify expectations and modify tasks with many steps into manageable bits for the child with special needs, as well as to allow creative and different ways to demonstrate learning. And also, please provide instruction in alternative ways, for example, using visual supports like I mentioned in the previous slide, or written instructions if the child can read. So I'd like to just give a simple example on modifying expectations. So for example, other children in the class may need to complete 6 mathematic questions, but for the child with special needs, we focus on the topic that the class is learning, probably simple single digit addition. And instead of completing 6 questions, the child with special needs may need to complete only 3 or 4 questions on single digit additions. And if the child is not able to write, then we change the way he or she responds to worksheets. Maybe do away with worksheets, use counters instead. So these are some of the examples that you can use to alter the task or process for the child with special needs in your class. And to end the presentation, I'll show you a couple of examples of the support strategies that I've talked about. So there is a communication board here for Josh, and the sentences and words that are used for this page, at least, are the ones that he will need to express his thoughts and wants quite often with his peers and teachers in the classroom. Even though this is this communication board showed is used on a digital device, not every child needs a digital device to communicate. It can be adapted to be printed out and laminated and compiled into a communication book. And next, I have an example of a page taken from a social story that talks about changes to a new schedule in the classroom. A social story about changes will help children with autism especially, when they find it difficult to deal with unpredictable events. So social story will help the child with autism or children with special needs in general to understand why changes happen and what kind of changes will happen and what kind of things they will anticipate when the changes happen. So you can find such resources online and you can get them free. And here on the left is a picture of a calm down corner, which has a box with some tools, sensory tools to help the child to regulate their feelings. And also I quite like this corner because it also has a visual guide to help the children to identify and express what they are feeling. And to the right of that picture is a visual support tool about calming strategies. It's named Calming Folder. Probably this child has a folder with choices or a toolbox with choices of the sort of tools that he or she can use to calm himself down. So besides, on the bottom, there is a short sentence of I need blank. It also includes 9 options for calming, for the child to calm himself or herself down. And I really like this because it offers the child choice and also is likely to include the tools that the child finds helpful to him, and the tools and the calming strategies that the child prefers to use to self-regulate. And here I have a couple of resources that you can access to find out more about the types of adaptations that you can use in the preschool setting. But if you have any questions about supporting children with special needs to adjust into a preschool setting or inclusive education in general, feel free to email me. My email is included in the first slide of this presentation. And thank you very much for listening to the end, and I hope you have a wonderful and fruitful learning throughout this event, and have a good day.